Welcome back to Higher Change. We are talking about health psychology in this chapter today. Health psychology is understanding the intersection of our physical health and our mental health, and are looking at how our thought processes affect our physical health. There was a girl who went to school one day, and before she got there, her friends decided to play a prank on her. And the prank was that they were all going to ask her, "Are you feeling okay?" And they're going to they wanted to see if they could make her feel sick. So throughout the day, they all asked her, "Are you feeling sick? Do you need to go home? Are you sure you're okay?" And by the end of the day, sure enough, she got sick and needed to go home. This demonstrates that our mindset and our outlook can shape our physical health. So, as we've said many times before, our mind is the driver for our overall health. So I had a chance to sit down with Dr. Grant Leitma, who's the chair of psychology at Washington Adventist University. He likes to talk about health psychology, and so I asked him some questions about how he believes that this is practical for our daily lives.
I'm Dr. Grant Leitma. I chair the psychology department here at Washington Adventist University. I've been here now going on my 37th year, which I enjoy a lot, meeting students and faculty and staff here. And I'm always excited to talk about psychology. Well, health psychology is a principle of application to our lives so that we can be more productive, more joyful, more thoughtful, more considerate of others. And we need help in terms of doing this on a regular basis. And for myself, I engage in a regular health practice of going to the gym 3 times a week to Planet Fitness. It's a great cost, it's not very expensive. And I go in the ARC trainer for 30 minutes each time, and I get a good workout. I come back home, I take a shower, I lay down, and my whole body just kind of relaxes. It's able to just feel at ease, and it's kind of a natural high, and it just feels good. I can concentrate better afterwards. I'm more relaxed with people. I think I'm just a more productive person. Yeah, we want to be very considerate about the fact that the way we think produces the kind of behavior we have, that everything psychological is simultaneously physiological. So if we think negatively, we'll produce a lot of negative emotions, and negative emotions produces negative behavior. Some people produce what's called ANTs, automatic negative thinking. No matter, even if something good happens, they go negative with that. And when you go negative like that, it increases stress levels, anxiety levels go up, your blood pressure goes up, you perspire more. It's not good for overall health. That kind of condition works against us, really.
We're going to look at some aspects of health psychology, and we're going to look at how we can control our parasympathetic and sympathetic systems. And a lot of that is through our breathing, how we breathe, and also through the ways we cope with stress. We're going to talk about stress too. So I'm out here in nature because nature is very calming. And if you think about ourselves, as oftentimes we get activated when we're under stress and our heart races, and if we go for a run down the road, our breathing gets faster. Those are all designed to help us if, for example, a bear is coming at us. On the other hand, if we're always under stress, then that's not a good thing. It can it can wear down on our bodies. The main point of the lesson today is that stress can be detrimental to our health unless we manage our stress effectively. In this lesson, you will list internal, environmental, and social factors that contribute to our stress. You'll describe what happens to the body after prolonged exposure to stress. You'll describe ways to regulate our nervous system's response to stress, and you'll identify coping strategies. In 1967, psychiatrists Thomas Holmes and Richard Rady conducted a study of stressful life events to see if they could predict illness. They found a small correlation between events and becoming ill. Now, in isolation, one specific event may not be enough to make somebody sick. However, when people experience multiple stressful life events, it could actually make someone sick. They made a list of the top most stressful life events for adults. And the number one most stressful event would be the death of a spouse. which is obvious for a lot of people because we can all imagine how devastating losing a loved one or a spouse would be. The number on the right, the change unit, represents the point associated with how stressful this is for somebody. And they use this by calculating the risk for illness afterward using medical records. And so losing a loved one or a spouse could actually put somebody at a great risk for illness, especially if you add it up. Now, as I said before, in isolation, these may not be enough. But if you add it up and you get to over 150, then you're at a moderate risk. And over 300, then you're definitely at risk for illness. So I want to encourage you to take a look at this list and see which ones apply to you. I will also show you a list for non-adults as well, because some young adults may identify more with that instead. So the second most stressful event in an adult's life is divorce. That's because divorce is very devastating financially and emotionally. It feels very rejecting, and it breaks families apart. The third most stressful is marital separation, which is right up under divorce, as it's very related. As you can see, the three most important or most stressful events in an adult's life all relate to a spouse. That says that who you choose to marry and the type of person you marry is going to play an important role in your happiness in your life. So that's why it's one of the most important choices one can make. The fourth most stressful event in an adult's life is maybe going to prison. That could be very stressful. Then followed by the death of a close family member. Actually, I would say, according to this list, they're both about the same level, 63. So losing a family member, such as a parent or sibling, would be very devastating. Then a personal injury or illness could also be stressful. That's because pain and disability could be very stressful to somebody. Now, the last one on this list on this screen is a surprise to a lot of people. A lot of people don't realize that getting married and entering into marriage can actually be very stressful. I can attest to this personally. I love my wife and I look forward to getting married, but I know that in the process of getting married, there's a lot of adjustments that happen. For example, you spend a lot of money in a short amount of time to pull off a wedding event. You have to invite hundreds of people. There's a lot of people to invite, to figure out who to invite. Then you have the blending of your families, and then there's getting along with in-laws. And sometimes families don't all get along. Then there's the family dynamics that go along with that. And then there is the stress of just planning the event itself. And that can be very stressful for people, especially if they've never had experience with this. As most people who are getting married don't have a lot of experience with their own weddings. So, because they haven't gotten married before, or maybe they have and it's only the second time. So it's a lot of planning to do with very little experience, and people don't know what to be prepared for. So that's why I always suggest to people, get someone to help you out, or get an older or wiser person who can help you manage all those transitions. The next most stressful event is getting fired or dismissed from a job. That can be very devastating, and it can cause depression for people. Then there's marital reconciliation. As a couples therapist, people don't often realize how stressful just trying to save a relationship can be, because there's the emotional work that goes into trying to save a relationship. People have to put in effort, and sometimes they can get rejected in the process. And then they have to open up their feelings, and then there's the stress of potentially losing a partner if it doesn't work. The next one on the same level is retirement. And that's because a lot of people don't know what to do. They don't know what's going to happen when they retire. It's a big change. They're going to have to try and find happiness in new ways. And then there's the stress of potentially losing income or trying to live on limited income. The next one after that is a change in health of a family member, especially if you're going to be caring for that person. So caregivers go through a lot of stress. I'm surprised it's not on this list, but I would probably put that on along with that. Then pregnancy. Here's another one that you would think is positive, but A lot of people don't realize how stressful a pregnancy can be. Well, especially if it's unplanned, but even if it is planned, it can be very stressful because people are especially for new parents, are entering into a new role in life, and they don't know or they don't have experience with this new role of being a father or mother, and that new change can be very stressful, especially if they didn't have a good role model growing up. Then they have to figure out, am I going to be a good parent? And so that can be very stressful. And so pregnancy is that transition time in between being a non-parent and then a parent. I think it's a good thing that we have those 9 months typically because you have the time to get ready. But then there's also the risk that comes with the physical changes and the medical risks that are associated with pregnancy, because you can lose either the mother or the child. And sometimes that happens. So that can be very stressful. The next event or next thing is sexual difficulties. This can be very stressful for people because it's very personal, and they can feel embarrassed if they're not able to perform sexually like they used to, or they may feel sad that they've lost some sexual functioning or their ability to perform or to enjoy sex. That can be very stressful for people. Sex is an important part of people's lives. And the next one is gaining a new family member. That's just because gaining new family members can be an adjustment for people because you have new dynamics and new personalities to understand. Now let's talk about stressful events for non-adults. This is especially important for young adults or college students because they may identify more with this list than with adults, the list for adults. So the most stressful event for non-adults is the death of a parent, especially if you still depend on that parent, or if you live with them or depend on them financially. And but obviously there's emotional loss as well. Anybody who's lost a parent will tell you how stressful and sad that transition can be. The next one would be an unplanned pregnancy or abortion. That would be very stressful, and it's right up there with the death of a parent. Actually, they're both rated at 100. An unplanned pregnancy for a non-adult can be very scary and stressful, and then an abortion is also very stressful and can be traumatic. Now, of course, some people would say it's not. In my experience working with young people who've gone through that, it is very stressful and traumatic, especially if they've received little information about it, which is why education about it is very important. The third most stressful event in someone's life is getting married, especially for a non-adult. Now, this is rated lower for adults, but this is higher. This is higher for non-adults because young people are not particularly ready for marriage, or they may not be ready, and they may need time to just be an adult and have time in their life to enjoy being single. And so this can be very stressful for someone who has an arranged marriage or whatever, especially if they're still young. The fourth, that's why that's right up there. Then there's a divorce of parents. Divorce can be very scary and stressful because when when parents are divorcing, it basically breaks the family apart. Then the children have to decide who they're going to live with, and then they're oftentimes pit in between them, and then there's conflict, and it just creates insecurity in the family, which is why this is very stressful for non-adults. The next one would be acquiring a visible deformity, and this is because for young people, this is important for their sense of identity. Then fathering a child. Now, this would be having a child, raising a child for a dad. Even if you are, I would probably put being a mother up there too. But the assumption here is that having a child is very stressful. And then lastly, a jail sentence of a parent for over 1 year is also very stressful. It's like losing a parent, essentially. Marital separation of parents is also very stressful. This is going along with divorce. It's right up there because it's creating that insecurity and pulling the family apart. Death of a brother or sister. Then there's change in acceptance by peers or being rejected by peers. That can be very stressful. Then there's unplanned pregnancy of a sister. Then discovery of being adopted. Wow, I know that I can imagine that would be stressful. I've talked to clients who've discovered that they were adopted, and that can be devastating, especially if it was kept secret from them for a long period of time. Then the marriage of a parent to a step parent. That is stressful because it's a new family structure, and it's going to require an adjustment between the step parent and the stepchild as they get to know each other, and as they adjust to parenting by a step parent. And then the last one on this list is the death of a close friend. That would also be very stressful for someone. So if your score is between 150 and 299, you have a moderate risk of illness. And if you have 300 or more, you're at a definite risk of illness. Of course, all this depends a lot on your coping resources. Like for some people, some of these things may not be very stressful. And for other people, they could be. Some people just have more ability to handle stress. They're more resilient because they have more resources. We're going to talk about resilience soon. So stress is the physical, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral responses to events that are perceived as threatening or challenging. And stress can take two forms. There's distress, and then there is eustress. Distress, as the name implies, is negative. Implies that this is a negative form of stress. And then eustress has a prefix EU, which literally means good. So this is a good form of stress. If you think of the words eulogy or euphemism, those words mean something good or imply something good, like a good word or a good way of putting something. So a good stress actually implies that there's some stress that can be good for us. We can have an optimal level of stress that motivates us to succeed in life. So that takes us to this chart that shows us that there's an optimal level of arousal that helps us to have an optimal level of performance in our lives. If we have too much stress in our lives, it can actually impair our performance because it creates anxiety, which can impair us. On the other hand, too little stress can actually result in a decreased attention to it and decreased motivation and interest. So we may not even bother to do something about it if we don't have stress. So that's why some students won't do homework if they're not stressed about it, because they don't see an issue. Oftentimes students will do homework like the night before something's due, because they need that push. They need the anxiety and stress to push them to be motivated to do something. And that's why deadlines are effective in encouraging people to get things done. So some stress actually motivates people. And some people, especially those of us who procrastinate, tend to require high levels of stress to be motivated enough to do something. Otherwise, they may be less inclined to do something just for the sake of it. So the events that cause stress are called stressors, and they can be either internal or external events. External stressors include situations in the environment or society or family that puts pressure on us. Internal stressors are the psychological things that we put on ourselves that cause us stress. So let's talk about environmental stressors. Environmental stressors include things like catastrophes, major life changes like moving, divorce, things like that we talked about before. And then the small things that are called hassles. Hassles are the things that we go through on a daily basis that can cause us stress, that can add up. For example, if you're sitting in rush hour traffic every day, that can be very stressful. If you get to work and you've had to sit through long traffic where you've had to constantly hit your brakes or people are cutting you off, that can make your day bad. And over time, repeated exposure to these hassles can wear on you over time. So those are environmental stressors. Then there is internal stressors. Internal stressors are the psychological stressors that we oftentimes create for ourselves. For example, pressure that we put on ourselves to perform or to succeed in a certain way, that we can create stress for ourselves. Uncontrollability is the lack of personal power or inability to control our situations. For example, if you're in a dead-end job where you can't do anything about it, or someone is telling you how to do your job and you don't have a voice, that can feel very stressful. Then there's frustration. Frustration includes the times when we want to accomplish a goal but we cannot do it, or when we're not able to meet a need. Those can create stress for ourselves because we have a goal in mind but we're not able to get it accomplished. Conflict can also arise when we have competing goals in our mind that work against each other. Like, say, for example, you want to be able to spend time with family, but you also want to succeed in work. And so that can create internal conflict. And then there's the conflict that we can have with other people that can also create stress as well. So conflict occurs when a person feels pulled toward two or more goals, but can only achieve one of them. That is an internal kind of conflict. Let's talk about physiological factors. We've looked at environmental and internal factors, but let's talk about physical factors and stress. Hans Selye was a Hungarian-Canadian endocrinologist who discovered the existence of biological stress. He was a pioneer in the study of the physical consequences of exposure to stressors. He came up with this idea of the general adaptation syndrome. General adaptation syndrome consists of 3 stages. First of all, we start out in a homeostasis. We start out with a balance of not having too much stress, but the optimal arousal, right? So we have our normal day-to-day functioning. That's not the first stage, but that's the baseline. The first stage is when we experience that stress or trauma due to a life event, and that creates an alarm. The alarm activates our sympathetic system so that we respond. The second stage is resistance. So we put up a fight, essentially. We go into fight mode or flight, but we basically go into activated mode where we are managing that stressful or traumatic event. And over a period of time, that can create exhaustion. So once we've gone through that stress and we've put up the resistance to it, after a while we will be exhausted. Just to give an example, I experience this sometimes when I do public speaking or teaching for long periods of time, especially if I'm talking about something on a personal level and doing a lot of it. So it can create a little stress, and that after a period of time, when I'm done talking, I feel literally wiped out. And sometimes, like for example, if I just finished a public talk, sometimes I just want to go home and sleep because I'm physically exhausted. And that's what stress can do. Even if you're not actually like working, like physically, just the stress on the body can create exhaustion. So we can see a diagram that really illustrates how this resistance changes over time. So we start out with that homeostasis, then we go into alarm. Basically, alarm mode is where we're kind of caught off guard, right? But then we put up that resistance, so we go into that fight mode where we're managing it and we're working hard to effectively cope with that stress. But over time, it can deplete our resources. If we're not able to resupply in our resistance, it can overwhelm us, and it can create long-term effects on our body as well. So that brings us to discussing the nervous system, because the nervous system is important to how we handle stress. the autonomic nervous system consists of the two parts that help us. The sympathetic nervous system is what manages the fight or flight response. And this is what is when we experience stress, it helps us to activate our responses so we can cope with it. The other one is the parasympathetic nervous system. And so after the stressful event occurs, the parasympathetic system helps us return our body to its normal state or homeostasis. Now, when we are in the sympathetic system, when that's activated, all the other systems in our body tend to take a backseat. Those things that are the things that are not as important to managing that stress. So the ability to run, for example, would be activated during stress. However, our digestion and our ability to sleep will not be as activated or it will not be as effective because we're in our fight mode. But when we're able to allow the parasympathetic system to be reactivated, then our body can then sleep and digest its food better. And then we can also pay attention to our needs for food and our need for sex as well. Otherwise, when we're under stress, we're more likely to experience indigestion, and we're going to lose our libido, and we're going to have difficulty sleeping. So stress also causes the immune system to react as though an illness or an invading organism has been detected, increasing the functioning of the immune system. So when we're under stress, the immune system is activated. However, as the stress continues or increases, the immune system can actually begin to fail. So that goes along with that exhaustion. Your immune system can also be exhausted as well. Let's talk about the psychological factors. We talked a little about some of the inward stressors we put on ourselves, but let's talk a little more about that. So, as I mentioned, there's a connection between our psychological side as well as the physical side. And that brings us to the subject of psychoneuroimmunology, as I talked about before with the immune system. Psychoneuroimmunology is a study of how psychological factors affect the immune system. So researchers have found that stress increases the activity of the immune system, as I said. If we have too much stress over time, then our immune system can be weakened. And so that puts us at a greater risk for illness and getting sick. So for example, if you go to sleep at night and you've been crying because you've been watching dramas, then you might actually be sick the next day. Or if you had an argument with a loved one before you went to sleep, then you might actually get sick because your immune system is weak or weakened. Stress increases your risk of getting sick. So you're more likely to get sick when you're stressed out. That's why students are actually the most vulnerable to getting sick around exam time. That just reminds me, at our last exam, I was passing out Kleenexes. It's not surprising because people's immune systems are weakened during exam times. I remember when I was a student around exam times, that's when I started to experience anxiety and a lot more stress. So I know how stressful those times can be. You have to be very careful to manage your health during those times. And don't allow your body to get too stressed out because it compromises your immune system. High levels of stress have been linked to increased risk of heart disease as well. So stress can decrease the amount of natural killer cells, which are the cells responsible for fighting cancerous growth. So it also puts you at risk for greater susceptibility to cancer as well. So these are major illnesses and diseases that you can contract as a result of stress. When I've seen people who are in cancer support groups or other support groups for disease, it's not surprising that many of them they're also going through major relationship challenges. It could go both ways. I've talked to people about this. On one hand, the disease itself can create stress on the relationship, and that can cause conflict. On the other hand, conflict in the relationship can create stress in people that make them more susceptible to disease. That's why, for me, I really believe that relationships are important for our health because it can create stress. And the most, as I said earlier, the biggest things we get stressed out about, or the biggest stressors in our lives, are oftentimes related to our romantic relationships. So that's why it's so important. I put marital and relationship health as the most important aspect of our health because it oftentimes trickles down to our mental health and into our physical health. Let's talk about health psychology in general. Health psychology studies how all these things are connected. So it looks at how physical, psychological, and social forces impact our health and illness. As I was talking about earlier about how relationships can play a role, they're looking at the interconnection of all of these. Clinical health psychologists then help promote healthy lifestyles. They look at lifestyle choices and how we can manage stress so that we can be physically healthy as well. So health psychologists study two things. They study behaviors and personal factors which impact health. Behaviors include things like your lifestyle choices, basically. Whether you're going to use drugs, whether you're going to be optimistic, your personality types, and your eating habits. Then they also are interested in the intersection of personal factors and how those impact health. For example, health disparities. So they're going to look at the role of poverty, wealth, religion, like social support, because these all religion and social support offer a sense of community and coping resources that help people deal with stress. They're also interested in personality as well as ethnicity. And that's because race and ethnicity can be factors in health disparities. So they're also interested in how health disparities can play a role. The cognitive mediational theory of coping proposed by Richard Lazarus states that the way people think about and appraise a stressor is a major factor in their stress response. As we looked at some of these stressors at the beginning of this presentation, for some people, some of those stressors may not be a big deal. Like maybe you don't think a wedding would be such a big deal. Well, that's because the way we appraise a stressor affects how we respond to it. So for example, if we think that something is overwhelming, it's going to be overwhelming. On the other hand, if we think we have the ability to cope with it, we will survive better. Of course, there's always those times when something is more stressful than we expected it to be, or when we don't have the coping resources that we thought we would. As, for example, with the weddings, oftentimes that's more stressful than people realize, as I said. But anyway, the point is that the way we appraise the stressor affects how we respond to it. And it's also how we appraise our own ability to respond to it that also makes a role. A primary appraisal involves estimating the severity of the stressor and classifying it as a threat, challenge, or loss, whereas a secondary appraisal allows an individual to determine what resources he or she has available for dealing with that threat or loss. So as I said, it could be about the threat itself, or it could be about our own sense of our ability to cope with it and respond to it. So there is a diagram here that illustrates how all of these intersect. So for example, at the top, we have the stressor in the environment. Then we have our own perception of how we perceive that stressor. And so we may consider it as a stress or not. That brings it to the primary appraisal. So we can interpret it as positive, dangerous, or irrelevant. Then there's a secondary appraisal. We can analyze our own resources. We can see ourselves as having insufficient resources, or we can see ourselves as having sufficient resources to cope with it. And then the way that can result in stress or not having stress. So if we have stress, then we can determine how we're going to cope with that stress. And there's two ways we can cope with that stress, which we're going to talk about. There's a problem-focused strategy, and then there's the emotion-focused strategy. And lastly, there's the reappraisal phase, and that's more about how we look at this stressor going forward, or what might we learn from it for the future. So the way oftentimes our personality affects how we perceive stressors. Stress has effects on your health. Over time, if you're exposed to stress for too long on a long-term basis, it can cause cardiovascular disease, hypertension, elevated heart rate and blood pressure, and some cancers, and risk for diabetes, etc. But people who have social support, who are more optimistic, or who have a sense of power or mastery, and a sense of confidence or self-esteem, can respond to stress better. That's because they have internal and external resources to cope with that. And so they're less susceptible to disease and they're more resilient. Women also tend to have more social resources to deal with stress than men do. Men tend to isolate themselves, and that may be why women live longer than men. Something to think about. Men oftentimes complain about not living as long as women, but we have to consider, how do we deal with stress, and do we turn to other people for support or not? A lot of times men are less likely to do that. And as a man, I would say that's very sad, because we oftentimes miss out on quality relationships that can be very helpful for us. So there's 3 different types of personalities that people often have that affects how they cope with stress. There's a type A personality, then there's a type B, and then there's type C. Type A personalities are driven, hostile, and impatient. The type B personality is relaxed, they're patient and chill. And then there's type C. These people tend to be repressed people pleasers. So you can see they're kind of on different ends of the spectrum. Type A, they tend to be more aggressive and hostile. On the other hand, type C, they are passive. And both of these can actually create stress. We oftentimes think of the type A personality as having stress because they are driven and they put pressure on themselves. On the other hand, type C people can also create stress simply because they are not able to get their needs met, and the stress can come from repressing their needs and not being able to get their needs met, basically. So that is an internal conflict, usually. So type A personalities, people who are competitive, ambitious, and hostile, are more likely to develop heart disease than people with a type B personality, due primarily to the hostility dimension of the personality cluster. So there's some good things about type A people in the sense that they're ambitious and they're go-getters, whereas type B people, maybe not. On the other hand, the downside about being a type A personality is that usually their level of anger can actually create health problems for themselves. They're more likely to get heart disease, for example. A type C person, in which people hold in their emotions and they tend to be people pleasers, these people are currently being investigated for the possible link with cancer rates. And so again, that goes back to the internal stress that's caused by not voicing your needs. A hardy personality is associated with decreased illness due to stress. These people they thrive on stress, and they strive based on that stress, but they lack the hostility. So they are go-getters, but they're not easily angered. And these people are able to get their needs met without feeling all that anger and hostility that can wear down on us. So let's talk about 2 other kinds of people. There's pessimists and then there's optimists. Pessimists focus on the negatives and have been found to have significantly more stress-related health problems than optimists, who look for positives and have less stress. So these are the kinds of people who see the glass as half full versus the glass as half empty. Pessimists see the glass as half empty, whereas optimists see the glass as half full. Hopefully we all see the good in life, but sometimes people want to see things realistically, and so they tend to look for negatives. There's also social factors that can play a role in our stress levels. Social factors include things like poverty and job stress. Poverty creates stress because you're unable to afford the basic necessities of life. This is very challenging for people. It can be very stressful. Now, the other one is it's kind of the opposite of that. People may actually have a job, so they can actually be well paid, and yet they can experience a lot of stress. This is because of several factors. They can have a high workload that is expected of their job. They may experience a lack of control about their job. Maybe they're in a subordinate position and they don't have a feeling, or they don't feel that they have a voice about the work that they do. Or maybe they're concerned about their job security. Maybe they get paid very well, but they're afraid they're going to be let go once the economy goes down, or maybe when a project goes bad. And so fear of losing one's job can also create stress. And dissatisfaction can also be stressful. If you're simply just not happy with the job because it's not something you enjoy doing, or maybe it doesn't create a sense of meaning, that can create stress for people. And the last one is burnout. If you have invested yourself emotionally in something, but then it doesn't turn out right, or maybe you've just exhausted yourself due to all the stress and the emotional investment, that can create burnout as well. And that can be a form of stress as well. Social factors play a role in the amount of stress an individual experiences. So as I said, living in poverty and job stresses are two major sources of stress. And a serious consequence of job stress is burnout, or negative changes in thoughts, emotions, and behaviors as a result of prolonged stress or frustration. As a counselor or a therapist, I can experience burnout if I'm not careful. If I have too many hard cases that I'm working with, or all my clients have such major sad stories or traumas that they're going through, if I'm not careful, or if I'm not managing my own stress, that can create burnout for me as well. So that's why they say therapists oftentimes need therapists. Same with any healthcare professional. You have to be careful about burnout. Like, for example, if you're a doctor and you've lost 2 patients in one day, or over a period of time you've lost a lot of patients, that can create burnout as well. Acculturated stress describes the stress an individual experiences when having to adapt to a new culture. So the method of adaptation can affect the stress level. So some of the methods of adapting to a new culture include integrating, assimilation, separation, and marginalization. Basically, this means you can integrate your old culture with the new. You can assimilate yourself completely into the new culture, or you might find yourself being separated from the new culture and isolated somewhat. And furthermore, you can even be marginalized by the new culture. The level or the type of acculturation can actually create stress for people. And the negative effects of social factors on health can be minimized by a strong social support system. So that's why it's important for people to find a safe place or a group to belong to. You'll find that a lot of new college students, for example, will find themselves in a clique or a freshman group because they need that safety. They need that group of people to belong to as they face a new environment. And same thing with any group that is migrating to a new area. We need social support. And whatever stress you're going through, it's good to have a social support system. That's why there's support groups for people who are surviving cancer, or they've survived a health crisis. There are various different social support groups for whatever stress you're going through. Let's talk about how people cope with stress. So as I said, social support systems can help people cope with stress. It's very important. Coping strategies are actions that people take to master, tolerate, reduce, or minimize the effects of stressors, and they include both behavioral and psychological strategies. So there's 2 types that I'll mention today. There's the problem-focused strategy, and that simply looks for solutions to the problems. It's an active approach, so you're taking action to figure out how to resolve the stress. That's one way. Another way, it has more to do with when you're not able to actually solve the problem, or it's outside of your control. then we have to find another strategy. And that oftentimes is an emotion-focused strategy. Emotion-focused strategies simply deal with the way we react to it. So rather than obsessing about something or trying to change the situation, it may simply involve accepting the situation and moving forward. So problem-focused coping occurs when a person tries to eliminate the source of stress or reduce its impact by taking some action. Emotion-focused coping involves a person changing the way he or she feels about or reacts to a stressor. And oftentimes this may include forgiveness. Forgiveness can be a very important tool in helping people deal with stress and especially trauma. Especially if it's not, you can't erase the past, but you can change the way we respond to it. Culture can also affect an individual's level of stress as well as the strategies they use to cope with that stress. So, for example, in some environments put a lot of stress on people. And then cultures affect how we cope with that stress. So, for example, if you're in an environment where people stuff their emotions, then that may be one way you handle your stress. So how do we calm our nervous system? How do we manage the stress and the anxiety in our body? So if you were to take a moment and just pause this video, you could stop and do some jumping jacks, okay? You can do that for a minute. And then I want to ask you, how does this affect your heart rate and your breathing? So for example, if I stop and do jumping jacks, I know my heart rate is going to be beating fast and my breathing is going to increase. Then I would like you to pause and close your eyes and then take some deep breaths. You can breathe with me for a second. Breathe in and then breathe out. How does this affect your breathing and your heart rate? Obviously, you have to do this over a minute. So you might want to just pause this and just try it out for a minute. So as you close your eyes, take some deep breaths, then pay attention to your breathing as well as your heart rate. You may find that your heart rate slows down after a minute, especially if you're to monitor it using a heart monitor. So changing your breathing is actually the only way to directly manipulate the parasympathetic nervous system. Let me repeat that. Basically that means that if you're trying to be proactive and activating your parasympathetic nervous system, like maybe you've been experiencing a lot of stress and you know that your heart rate is fast and your breathing is fast and you want to bring it down and be calmer, then one way to do that is to take in longer breaths. I do this sometimes when I have a client who is panicking. Sometimes breathing with them can be very helpful. So, for example, I had a woman who disclosed in a group that she had been raped, and I'm sorry for this trigger, but she had to step out of the group because this triggered her anxiety, and she was experiencing a very great panic attack. And so I stepped out of the room with her. And I just asked her to look into my eyes and breathe with me. And so breathing was helpful in helping her engage her parasympathetic system. And then she is able to calm down after a minute. So breathing is a very important tool. So an optimal level of, and this is also important for even our sex life, an optimal balance of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system are necessary for peak sexual performance. Oftentimes people want to perform well sexually, but unfortunately we can have too much of one thing. If you have too much of the sympathetic system, it may go too quickly. On the other hand, if you're too relaxed, it may not be as exciting. So, and a balance of the two is important for sexual performance. And maybe you don't care about that now, but I know that many of my students or listeners are adults who are interested in getting married and enjoying that someday. So it's important to know that. So each inhale, as you inhale, it activates the sympathetic system. So, for example, when you panic, you hyperventilate. People who are panicking oftentimes are breathing really fast. And so that's why they actually might even get lightheaded because they're not getting enough oxygen. Their breathing is shallow and it's quick. But each exhale activates the parasympathetic system. So both are involved, as I said, in peak sexual performance. You need the sympathetic system for arousal. That's why anxiety is oftentimes linked to sexual arousal patterns. But you also need the parasympathetic system to prolong the pleasure, or it will be too fast. So let's talk about other things like spontaneity and creativity. A lot of students want to do well in school, and so this is also very important for academic success. And J.L. Moreno, who helped found a form of drama therapy known as psychodrama, believed that stress or anxiety is actually opposed to spontaneity and creativity. So if you're an artist or a musician or poet or whatever, anxiety will create that writer's block or artist block where it makes it hard to be creative. So how do you overcome that? How do you get to have that spontaneity and creativity back? Well, that's where you need to re-engage your parasympathetic system. So, for example, this is by Deepak Chopra. This quote says, "The best use of imagination is creativity. The worst use of imagination is anxiety." So imagination can be useful, but it can also be problematic in creating stress. Something to think about. Just to share with you a story. Whenever I get up or my own personal experience, whenever I go to do public speaking, sometimes I'll get nervous, especially in front of large crowds. But I find that when I stretch my arms out and stretch my fingers, and then I take deep breaths, I can re-engage my parasympathetic system. And also prayer will help me as well. So prayer can help me to refocus and calm myself as well. And so then when I get up, I am alert and yet I'm relaxed. So I have that perfect balance of the parasympathetic and sympathetic system. Now, other ways to calm the nervous system include recreational activities. If you're always working, that's not good. If you're work all the time, that can actually be taxing on your body. It can wear down your body over time. So that's why it's so important to engage in recreational activities where you can just take time to rest and recuperate. So spending time in nature and exercising can engage both sides of your sympathetic and parasympathetic system. It can help you relax and can burn off some of that stress. Exercising, ironically, while it may engage your sympathetic system, it actually helps you to burn cortisol, which is that stress hormone. And so if you're not exercising, you can actually get elevated levels of cortisol over a period of time. So if you want to burn off some of that stress or get rid of some of that anxieties, exercise can actually be helpful in reducing that. Other activities include play and playfulness. Laughter is the best medicine, as they say. Sometimes just being able to relax and laugh with people can help your nervous system. And lastly, the arts and aesthetic pleasures can be very useful in activating the parasympathetic system because it really requires you to engage the creative side of yourself. It's hard to really enjoy art when you're uptight. It requires you to relax and to calm yourself and to be able to really see the beauty around you. And I would say that it applies to just being able to see the beauty around us in general. That helps us to calm ourselves down. I want to also mention the word pneuma. This links our breathing with our mind. This is a word that is seen in the Bible. It's a Greek word that is translated for the spirit, but it's also used for the word for breathing. For example, if you get a pneumonia, that means you have an infection of your lungs or your breathing. So there seems to be in the Bible, there's this connection between the spirit and our breathing. And I would say that's because you need the parasympathetic system to be activated if you want to be creative and to have some kind of inspiration. So, like I said, pneuma is, or pronounced pneuma, is a Greek word that means both spirit and breath, which is really interesting. If you want to be inspired, the word for inspiration literally means breathing in. So inspiration sounds like respiration. That's because there's a connection between our breathing and our thinking. There's other ways we can calm our nervous system. There's meditation. And this consists of mental exercises to refocus attention and alter your level of consciousness. And it's been found to be an effective coping strategy. But there's different kinds. And just to be clear here, the discussion here is not to promote all forms of meditation, as some may be less helpful than others. This information is mainly informational, for your information only. So I'm not necessarily advocating one or the other, just it's for your information. So have you ever had difficulty focusing on your schoolwork? A lot of us have had. I know when I was in school, there's been many times when I would struggle to focus on writing, or I'd have writer's block, or just there's a lot of things going through my mind and I just can't focus on the thing I need to focus on. So what do we do in those times? Well, taking time to breathe consciously with prayer or meditation can actually help you focus better. I have discovered that this works for me, and it may work for you. Just taking a minute to just stop and pray or meditate you may discover will actually help you to focus more on what you're doing. Another thing we can do also is just getting out in nature. Concentrative meditation is one form of meditation that focuses the mind on repetitive or unchanging stimuli to clear the mind or relax. So some people will focus on a sound or whatever. Mindfulness meditation is when a person increases awareness of oneself and surroundings, or purposefully pays attention to the present moment without judgment or evaluation. So that's different from concentrative in the sense that there's maybe some overlap, but rather than numbing out with a focus on one thing, mindfulness is actually paying more attention to our surroundings and to ourselves. And it's about accepting that what's going on rather than critically evaluating it. So just being aware of something can actually be very helpful. So this brings us to mindfulness is really about paying attention to the present moment. So it's about looking at what's going on in our bodies and what we're feeling in the moment. Prayer is a form of meditation. It can be a spiritual form of meditation if one is listening rather than talking. Sometimes I know when I've prayed before, I know when people pray, oftentimes they just do a lot of talking, but that's not necessarily the same as meditation, because you're not necessarily taking the time to listen. You're just talking in your head, and that's different. But having a meditative prayer can also be very helpful because it helps you to calm your nervous system, helps you calm down and pay attention to your own spiritual insights. Research has demonstrated a wide array of effects of meditation, including both psychological and physical effects, and it can increase cognitive functioning and decrease stress. It also can be combined with psychotherapy as well. That's one of the advantages of meditation. It can be adjunctive as well. So, and other practices include things like Chinese mindful practices like Tai Chi. And Tai Chi has been known to have psychological and physical benefits as well. Mental approaches such as muscle relaxation or guided imagery are used to treat a variety of mental disorders. So therapists oftentimes use that. It's just to help the patient or client to relax themselves, especially if they've experienced trauma and they're having a hard time moving forward and processing it. Sometimes just having a person go into like a deep state of relaxation can help the person to be able to talk about it in a safe way without being overwhelmed with the stress and the trauma. Yoga can also be helpful. However, the research results have been inconclusive and cautious. There are some things you have to be careful about as well. So let's talk about spiritual forms of coping. Religion is a powerful coping resource for many people. It offers social support, has positive rituals, it can encourage healthy behavior. So, for example, people who are religious are less likely to engage in risky behaviors, and they're more likely to take care of themselves. Religion also offers resources by offering hope. It gives people a future to look forward to, like heaven, for example, or it gives people the hope that they will see their loved ones again. It also provides a sense of purpose during difficult times. For example, if you're going through stress and or you've had a major catastrophe, religion can provide you a sense of meaning or purpose through it all. I had, just to give you an example, I had a guy who I talked to who was almost killed and in a car accident. He was in the hospital for a period of time, and it was a very traumatic event in his life. And I asked him the question, and it wasn't necessarily a religious question. I simply asked him, if you were to find a sense of meaning or purpose in all this, what you went through, do you think that you could find anything? And he said he thought about it, and he couldn't think about anything right away, but he came back the next session. He said, you know what, I thought about it, and when I thought about it, it prompted me to go back to church. So just this thinking about it actually encouraged him to seek out a religious explanation. But in the process, he thought about how when he was in the hospital, his estranged daughter, his daughter he hadn't seen in many years, actually came back and saw him again because she was concerned about him. So even though it was a major trauma for him, he was able to see a purpose in the sense that he was reunited with his daughter as a result. And so that provided him a sense of meaning that allowed him to move through that trauma. So there's some benefits of religious or spiritual involvement, but it depends a lot on if the religion emphasizes love and forgiveness rather than punishment and guilt. Religion, as we've said before, can be toxic and can have negative consequences, especially if it overemphasizes punishment and guilt. However, religions that emphasize grace can have some benefits as well. So does attending religious services affect our life expectancy compared to those who have similar health behaviors but are not attending religious services? Well, research shows that the average life expectancy of those who attend religious services compared to those who do not is 7 years longer than those who do not attend religious services. That's a major difference in life expectancy. And that may have to do with all the things we've talked about: social support, having coping resources, coping strategies, and those kinds of things, so that when people do experience stress in their lives, they can bounce through it and be resilient. Another thing that can also help people is acts of service. People who engage in altruistic service to others are able to be healthier as well, because it snaps them out of negative thinking that can get them down. So acts of service disrupts our unhealthy ruminations and helps us to snap out of our greed, jealousy, or self-centeredness, which can wear down on us and make us feel stressed. When we help other people, we're less stressed. Helping people helps us heal our own wounds. And we're happier when we help other people. And it gives us a greater sense of self-esteem and sense of purpose. We can feel like we have a sense of fulfillment because we are doing something good for other people. And people who do service for others are also physically healthier and may live longer. So on the other hand, those who do so out of an internal sense of obligation or duty may actually be at a risk of caregiver burnout. We talked about burnout earlier. So if you're just doing it out of duty and over a longer period of time, that service can actually turn to burnout. But if you're doing it because you want to and because it's something you enjoy doing, that can actually make you feel happy and lead to better health in general.
I would recommend number one is getting in touch with scriptural readings. The last 5 chapters of the book of Psalms is a good place to go. Book of Ephesians. It's just very uplifting. It can change the way your brain patterns even work. That you're putting in something of a divine origin in your mind can change the way you do things. You make concerted efforts in terms of the kind of diet and lifestyle you decide to go into. All the B complexes that we get through eating walnuts and things like that can make a big difference. So it's your lifestyle, it's drinking enough water, it's getting enough rest and sleep, ingesting good food, also in terms of what you watch, what you see, what you read. All these things are very beneficial type of things. And I know your students have been learning about PNI, psychoneuroimmunology, and to me that's a favorite topic of mine because that includes talking about the way you think and feel influences your immune system. And if you suppress your immune system, you get what? You get sick, and stuff. So I think the message we have, I think that's good for young people to understand is that we want to be in good health so we can understand what the Spirit of God is speaking to us and that we can have that vital link through prayer with Him, at the same time, thing. So we have a very positive duty to resist melancholy thoughts, and to resist negativity and spend our time looking at more positive influences.
Sometimes we just need to take a moment to breathe. Allow ourselves to breathe slowly because that allows our heart rates to slow down and our breathing to slow down, of course. It allows the tension in our bodies to dissipate. Some of the anxiety can go away. I know some people who suffer from panic disorder, panic and anxiety. One of the best ways to control that is simply just through breathing, taking deep breaths, because that can help us to slow down and calm ourselves down. If you've been having difficulty studying or focusing on school, sometimes you just need to take a moment to breathe. And while you're doing that, we can think about other ways to cope with the stress. Things like meditation, prayer. Prayer has been very helpful to me in my own life, for example. But these kinds of things can be very helpful to people as it helps them to calm their nervous system. And for me, when I am able to calm my nervous system, it helps me to be able to focus better and am more creative, and I can and think better. We're going to talk about more ways we can develop a greater awareness of ourselves and gain some peace in our lives. But basically, some of the strategies we've been talking about and we'll talk about include things like meditation, prayer, being outside in nature, talking to people. Sometimes talking to somebody and finding support can be very helpful to us if the person's a good listener. But changing the way we think can be very helpful. Not ruminate, finding ways to stop ruminating about the negative things in our lives. When we find ourselves in a natural setting like this, it helps us to become more attuned to what is it that we're really wanting in life. Many times we're stressed out because we're trying to attain materialistic possessions and we're trying to achieve a certain status in life. But when it's just us in the quiet of nature, it reminds us that there's only so many things we really need in life to be happy. That brings me to the discussion on spirituality. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians about how he's been through so many things in his life, and he faced a lot of stresses and trials, and yet he found a way to be content through it all. And let's look at that. How did he find that contentment? Many people in this life, including myself, want to find contentment. We want to be happy. We want to be happy despite our circumstances. How do we find that contentment? How can we relax and be calm and have peace in our lives?
Philippians 4 is a very good place to go in terms of looking at how Scripture tells us the way we think influences our behavior. So that Paul says that whatever is virtuous, whatever is praiseworthy, whatever is lovely, whatever is a good report, he says for us to think on those things. So the principle there is what's known as thought control, that we're responsible for the thoughts we have, and that if you find yourself getting negative, first of all, you want to be away from negative people. You don't want to spend a lot of time being a news junkie and watching so much news on the media because it's so negative that you end up functioning in a very negative way as a result of it. So we can control these things, but it takes our effort to do it, and to do things maybe a little bit differently. But the reward from doing it far exceeds any kind of negative feedback from it.
There have been times in my life when I've had so much stress that I've had to go to the doctor because I've been sick or I've experienced pain in my body due to one thing or another. And a lot of times it's been around points of stress in my life, whether it was an exam or other things that cause stress. When I stop and think about it, I realize that a lot of times it's because of the pressures I put on myself. Pressures that that I put on myself to find a sense of purpose and meaning in life. I oftentimes drive myself to succeed because I want to accomplish a goal. But then when I realize that I can't keep doing this to myself, I realize I need to step back. But that itself is a spiritual process, because I realize that I need to surrender my stresses, the things that worry me, to God. And that sometimes is very liberating. And also at the same time, sometimes humbling as well, because I realize I'm not the master of the universe and I can't save everybody. So our mental health is very important to our stress is important to our mental health, and there's also a spiritual connection as well. Ellen White talked a lot about how the mind is the master controller for our overall health. She said that the brain is the organ and instrument of the mind and controls the whole body. In order for the other parts of the system to be healthy, the brain must be healthy. It seems to be a pretty simple, straightforward concept, but not a lot of people understand that. They tend to think of the brain as something that's separate, or the mind as something that's separate from the body. But we have to understand that the brain is really central to our health. I think of mental health as the most important aspect of our health. She also writes, many imagine that every slight exposure will cause illness, and the evil effect is produced because it's expected. And many die from disease that cause of which is wholly imaginary. Unfortunately, many people stress themselves from their own imagination, and they turn to searching their symptoms on Dr. Google, which tends to not be very reassuring if you've ever done that. If you tend to focus on illness, you will likely worry yourself to sick. If you want to be physically healthy, we have to think healthy. Another way to stop a negative imagination is to basically imagine something positive. Many of us are stressed simply because of the stress we put on ourselves. We're not happy or content with our circumstances, or we're anxious and we do not have peace in our lives. I think of the spiritual principle that Jesus talked about, how we're trying to serve two masters. You can't serve both God and money at the same time. It can create a lot of stress. As I said, I would put a lot of pressure on myself to succeed, but then and that stress would create this over focus on my own health. But when I realized that I need to put my health in God's hands, but I also realized that I need to put my own whole life in His hands, and that I can't focus on whether I'm going to live and die each day. And when I let go of that, then it allowed me to have peace. So many people I know who suffer from health anxiety, for example, are really just lacking peace in their lives because they're afraid of dying. What would happen if their lives stop continuing on? Would they have a sense of purpose and meaning in their lives? So sometimes we just have to stop and take a deep breath, and not ruminate over the things of this world, things around us. There's a commandment that where in Exodus 20 it says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, right? This idea to stop ruminating about what's going on for other people. Sometimes we just need to focus on ourselves. So one way to stop worrying is just take a deep breath. Breathing is related to calming our nervous system and allows us to think creatively, which may be why prayer can actually help us to focus better. And that may be why there's a link between respiration and inspiration, as we said earlier. But there's essentially two approaches to suffering. There's the Eastern way, and then there's the Western way. I want to talk a little about this. Buddhist concepts, we're going to talk about the Buddhist concept first. Buddhism started with Siddhartha Gautama, who is known as Buddha. And it was Buddhist concepts of mindfulness and awareness about oneself, as well as acceptance of the way things are, have contributed greatly to the field of mental health. And Buddhist concepts of attachment or of contentment through detachment have been very important. A lot of therapies are based on Buddhist concepts of contentment. As we talked about earlier, just being present and focused on the present and being aware of our surroundings and just allowing ourselves to be content is a revolutionary concept that seems to have made a big difference in the mental health field. So the Buddhist concepts of attachment or of acceptance is very important. Acceptance of the present. So they talk a lot about detachment from the cravings or attachments in the world. And they find freedom from suffering, which comes from not being attached to the things of this world. Now, I'm going to talk about this from a critical perspective too, but I just want to mention some of the important things. Contentment means, from a Buddhist perspective, accepting our lives and our world the way it is, not trying to change it. And sometimes our ideas of hope can make it difficult to find peace if we're always looking forward to the present. For example, ambitions that we have for ourselves can create stress. Like, for example, I always wanted to be make a difference in the world, and I always wanted to do that by making an impact. But then when I realized when I want to make an impact and measure my success on that impact, then I may be discontent if I'm not able to do that. So sometimes that ambition and that hope can actually set you up for more stress. On the other hand, simply accepting yourself the way things are and the situations the way they are can actually help us to find peace in our current moment. And if you think about it, would you love yourself and accept yourself the way you are now, not where you ought to be? Some people will never love themselves until they lose 20 pounds, for example, or until they graduate. But can you love yourself now the way you are? Can you find that acceptance? And loving kindness, and they talk a lot about loving kindness towards others is really based on freedom, not so much depending on that person to love us back, because it's all about detachment. So we detach ourselves from whether that person loves us back, which can offer some freedom. However, there are some dangers in this approach, which I want to talk about. And this is referenced in a blog article called Potential Psychological Dangers of Meditation, especially relevant for those with PTSD. And they cite the book, Michael Eigen's book, The Psychoanalytic Mystic, and an article, Meditation, the Dark Side of a Good Thing. So there's some issues in detachment that I think is also important from a psychological perspective. So if your meditation focuses on detachment, it may result in isolation, the lack of human contact, putting up emotional walls, and increased narcissistic and self-centered tendencies. So for example, if you keep telling yourself, well, I'm not going to let other people affect me, then you're just going to become selfish and focus on your own needs. And you're going to think you're great and everybody else is not important. As you seek enlightenment, then you're going to be stepping on other people in the process of gaining enlightenment. The other thing is that it lacks integration of the negative emotions. While they do recognize the importance of awareness about all emotions, what to do with negative emotions is not necessarily clear, because the whole purpose of this is to be free of suffering. So if your goal is to be free of suffering, well, then what do you do with emotions that are suffering emotions? So rather than integrating it, then it ends up being about avoiding those things. So becoming detached from ourselves, it also can result in becoming detached from ourselves. Because if your focus is on detachment from the things that cause suffering, then you may become detached from the things that cause you suffering, from your own emotional needs and your own convictions. So John Burnside writes this quote, which is relevant. He writes, in almost every tradition of spiritual and ascetic practice, and this is referring to the meditation practice, in almost every tradition of spiritual and ascetic practice, whether it be the Platonist pure pursuit of the good, the Buddhist disciplined search for right action, or the early Christian caritas, detachment is a recurrent theme. So detachment is very common. That's why I talk about it. I'm not necessarily judging it. But perhaps in our rush to take in the ideas of Eastern thought, we have misunderstood the central concept. Certainly have been many who have seen detachment as a form of smug quietism practiced by those who feel somehow superior to the ordinary run of human affairs. The thing to understand is that the practice of detachment has nothing to do with an easy withdrawal into saint-like, wise, complacent seclusion. More often than not, the demons of our nature love a recluse. Nobody's more vulnerable to himself than the solitary. To imagine that one can simply withdraw and somehow achieve peace or wisdom or detachment is a mistake. It is also, in most cases, inappropriate, selfish, and even cowardly. It's a pretty bold statement if you think about it. With a few exceptions, the only valid withdrawal is a temporary one. To practice detachment, one must be in the world, in the chaos of emotions and needs and conflicts that make up ordinary life. If the world is sometimes disappointing, so be it. A just life is one that must be lived in the midst of disappointment. This is quoted by Douglas Todd in the article, Can Spiritual Detachment Lead to Complacency? I agree with the point there, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with detachment from, I don't think there's anything wrong with meditation, for example, and there's a place for detachment. But if we're detaching from our emotions and things that cause us suffering, they can also have negative effects. So I actually encourage people, rather than thinking about avoiding suffering as the goal of Buddhism is, I come from a Christian perspective that actually teaches us to embrace suffering. So rather than seeing suffering as something to escape and to avoid, we see something, we actually look for the good in suffering. So, and that's because to love people is to open ourselves to suffering, and that's okay. I've seen so many clients in my life who see suffering as something to avoid, and that if they experience suffering, then that something's going wrong. And I say to them, no, actually suffering's a good thing. It says you're alive, that you're fully alive, because if you weren't suffering, then you've never really lived. So rather than seeing suffering as something to avoid, we embrace it. And like I said, people think suffering is something that must be avoided at all costs. So they avoid going into relationships because they cannot bear the possibility of hurt and rejection. And that, as Burnside said, is probably cowardly if you think about it. To live in this world is to experience suffering. And that reminds me of what Jesus taught in the gospel and in the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount was all about how do we find happiness. In Matthew 5:4, he said, "Happy are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." How do we it says, happy are those who mourn. That basically we can find happiness in our suffering. But how do we do that? The key here really is in the last part. They will be comforted. That is something that you cannot find in an impersonal religion. Knowing that we can be comforted says that there's somebody out there who cares about us. So that brings us to what Christianity offers. This is not to say that there's nothing in the other religions, but I believe that Christianity offers something unique and special. We are able to embrace suffering because we know somebody cares about us and that we matter. And I would also say that despite some Christians that give them a bad rap, Abrahamic faiths also have something to offer our mental health. That is an a priori assumption that humans have an identity, purpose, and inherent worth, and that we sense through relationships with each other and God our own sense of purpose and value. So when we are in relationships with others, we experience our purpose and value. And so it's really relational. Paul writes a lot about how he experienced his own stress. In 2 Corinthians 4, verses 8 and 9, he writes, "We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." Some people see these kinds of suffering as bad. Like, for example, if you look at this from a karma perspective, some people see this as, wow, you must have done something wrong. So the good thing about like people who look at karma, the good thing is that they at least understand that it's our inward character rather than our deeds that are rewarded in this life, right? So the assumption then is that good actions lead to good rebirths, whereas bad deeds lead to bad rebirths. But the question then is, how do we account for suffering in this world? And why do bad things happen to good people? And this question is for everybody, not just Christians. Some people think this is only Christians have to answer the question of why do bad things happen to good people. But everybody has to answer that question, really. Why do bad things happen to good people? So when we look at this question, really, he actually sees, suffering can happen to people even when they're good, and yet despite the suffering, good can come out of it. So Paul was somebody who found freedom from his suffering. But how do we achieve that kind of resilience? Well, that brings us to the subject of hope. This is something that is unique in that what Christianity offers. Christianity offers people hope. Going back to that passage where in 2 Corinthians 4, he says, "We are hard pressed on every side. We are persecuted, but not abandoned." That key phrase, "not abandoned," gives us a clue. It's a clue that we know someone cares about us. It's relational. We're not abandoned. We do not ignore the suffering in the world, but rather we increase our awareness of, and as he writes in 2 Corinthians 4:17, he says, "We're increasing our awareness of an internal glory that far outweighs them all, of all the suffering." So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. So for Christians, we have a hope in a better future, whether it's on this earth or on the new earth. But somehow there's hope. Now, some see this kind of hope as delusional, though. Why hope for something that's not grounded in reality? Isn't it better to accept the reality that we live in? And isn't hope not really accepting of our present situation? Well, I would say that's not necessarily true. Hope is not about ignoring the present struggles that we go through. In fact, it's certainly about being aware of what's going on. We wouldn't need hope if everything was going fine. Rather, it's about moving forward in the midst of our suffering. That's what it's about. It's not about blind faith, but rather it's about trusting that someone out in the universe cares about us and that we have significance. Paul knew what suffering and stress was. In fact, he was very much aware of it. He writes in 2 Corinthians 11, I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. In other words, they lashed him to the point of death, but they didn't kill him. And that's how he went to that 5 times. So he knew what suffering was about. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. 3 times. I mean, one time, wow. But 3 times? I spent a night and a day in the open sea. Wow. How many people have done that? I have been constantly on the move. Talk about moving stress. Stress from moves. He knows what that's about. He's constantly moving. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, and in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in dangers in the city, in danger in its country, in danger at the sea, and in danger from false believers. Basically, he's been through a lot of trauma. If anybody has any right to PTSD, it would be Paul. He's been through a lot of trauma in his life. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. So he knows what it's like to stress and not have sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and I have gone without food. Talk about stress from poverty, not knowing what you're going to eat. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. So even when he's not going through these major negative life circumstances, he understands what it's like just to have the daily stress of managing multiple churches that he was in charge, felt responsible for. So he had a lot of pressure. But how did he deal with that? You know, Paul was able to cope with his stress and all the trauma he went through because he saw a greater purpose. In fact, he writes in the next chapter, therefore, in order to keep me from being conceited, and I think he means that in a joking way, at least about all the stresses he was able to survive, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. And talk about suffering. He pled, it says 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But did God take away his suffering? Was he able to find freedom from that suffering? But he said to me, as God said to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness, in your suffering. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. Now, rather than seeing suffering as something to avoid, he saw suffering as an opportunity to demonstrate God's power in his life, and therefore he was able to boast even more about what God did in him. And think about it, he has amazing testimony of all the things he went through, and he was killed in the end, but with all that he went through, he was an amazing testimony for Christianity, and it was such an influence. He wrote the New Testament and basically helped launch Christianity. You know, I think about people who I've talked to who've gone through suffering. I think of a person who I know who was a Christian, and he grew up in a missionary family, and he once he suffered a lot of pain, and he asked for prayer that pain would be taken away. And yet the prayer didn't work. And so he gave up hope. You know, he said, the feeling was, why get my hopes up if I'm just going to be disappointed? And so, unfortunately, it was, he took the realistic route. He wanted to be realistic. But the downside of that is it left him depressed, because without hope, he couldn't see the positives in life. And I remember asking him this question. I'm just curious. whatever happened to that pain that you experienced? And he said, oh, it went away. And I said, well, it's interesting. I wonder if your prayer was answered, just not maybe in your time, And I challenged him to think about ways he could see hope again. And, that was a very helpful question to him. I think it got him thinking. But, for Christians, I would say that we can find contentment and happiness, but it's not through avoiding suffering. It's not through detachment, but it's rather through embracing our suffering, because when we do that, we are embracing our attachments. It's interesting. This is what Paul says that helps him. Suffering, he said, that is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Not because of his own weakness, but because of God's strength in him. It was he could experience that relationship. So we experience contentment and happiness through an attachment. That brings us to the last passage. This is Philippians 4. And I like this. This is just one to end on. It just pulls it all together nicely. He says, I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. You know what? If you look at that passage alone, he sounds like he'd be the perfect Buddhist. He accomplished that sense of detachment, or it seems like he's got that sense of detachment because it doesn't matter what the circumstances are. He accomplished that sense of contentment, right? But how? How do you accomplish it? Because if it's on your own willpower, essentially eventually you will burn out because you don't have that something to feed it. But here's what he says. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. It's because we have a relationship with God that says we matter and that someone cares about us, that we're then able to detach from the other things. We can focus on that one relationship because it gives us that purpose. We can know that there's a purpose and meaning, and that through it all, no matter what suffering we go through, that we still matter and we still care to somebody. And that is hope. So and it's not a hope that ignores the negative realities of this world, but rather it says that, and it's not even a hope that necessarily is trying to change the world. It's simply that we have hope that somebody cares about us and we can trust that it'll all be made right someday. And that's the good news I want to share. I hope that my students will find contentment, and because ultimately that will help us to be free from the stresses that we put on ourselves. And the suffering that we experience, we will be able to cope with it because we know that somebody cares about us and is walking with us through it all. That I can do all this through him who gives me strength. I hope you can join us for the next chapter, Perfectly Abnormal. This we'll talk about the different kinds of abnormal behavior. We'll talk about psychopathology and how stress can go wrong. We looked at how we can cope with stress, but next we will look at how trauma and stress can wreak havoc in our personalities and our behaviors. So I hope you can join us. Thank you for listening.